Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen to the Planning Committee being held at 6 p.m. on the 6th of April 2023. Just as a polite reminder, this meeting is also being live streamed. So with that, we can get started. Item 1, apologies for absence. Kenna, do we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We've received one apology from Councillor Piccolo and he's been substituted by Councillor Mays.
Okay, thank you. On to item 2, items of urgent business. There are no items of urgent business. However, just a polite reminder that we are in the PERDA period, obviously in an election cycle. And with that, I'd just like to remind members that we are, we should abide by the issues and guidelines when making statements and contributions to this meeting. There are no statutory restrictions on the Council's decision-making process during this period. However, in order that meetings are not used as a political platform, only committees required for processing essential business of the Council, such as planning and the licensing committee, are advised to convene. With this in mind, members are reminded to conduct business tonight in an even manner and refrain from making statements which may affect public support for a political party or an individual candidate. More information on guidelines have been emailed to you in previous months and can also be accessed via the intranet. Okay, so that's that done. And with that, obviously, we are entering towards the end of the municipal year. I did want to take this opportunity to thank everyone this year on the Planning Committee for all your help and guidance, to the officers as well. Really enjoyed ourselves this year, and yeah, onwards and upwards to next year. And with that, we'll go on to declarations of interest. Item 3, do I have any declarations of interest? Councillor Tandy, thank you.
Thank you. I've got to declare interest. Being advised by a monitoring officer, I may have to be biased. I would excuse myself from agenda item 8.
Okay, and I imagine that's the same for number 9 as well, yeah? Thank you, Councillor Tandy, I appreciate that. Okay, declarations of receipt of any correspondence. So obviously this week we received a huge volume of emails from residents, mainly in relation to Ship Lane, both in favour and against the scheme. On behalf of the whole committee, I think we can agree that we've all received a whole host of emails. The only one I've received from a developer or an agent would be MD Star in relation to item 7. That's Mardyke Park, and I think we would have received members' packs in relation to them as well. Outside that, I'm not sure if there's been anything else. Are we all covered? Residential emails, yep, Ship Lane. Yep, Councillor Polly.
I've received a very late in the day email about a petition that was handed in last night, and I don't think that we've had a chance to look at that or validate that, but I concur with you, Chair. The only agent correspondence I've had is MD Star, and that was sent to the council office's recorded delivery, but I didn't pick it up until my pigeonhole till today. So, but concur with you. I think every member has been received a lot of traffic on all 3 applications tonight.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Polly. Okay, thank you. Right, on to planning appeals, found on pages 5 to 12. Do we have any comments on planning appeals? Lee, do you have anything you'd like to update us on? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. Reports for noting, but happy to field any questions. Thank you.
Okay, no questions there, and then that takes us on to a public address to the Planning Committee, which allows us to now discuss the items on the planning application items on the agenda here this evening. We've got 3 items, starting with item 7, found on pages 13 to 80. That's 22/01370/FUL, land adjacent to Wattswood, including Mardyke Farm. Matthew, if you'd be so kind as to present that report, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Before we go to the presentation, there are some updates from officers as well, so if you can bear with me while I run through these items of housekeeping. So since the time the report was drafted, we've had a consultation response from the Environment Agency, and that updates their original consultation response, and the updated response removes the previous objection on the basis of flood risk, but that would be subject to the local planning authority undertaking its statutory duties with reference to planning policies. So that would be applying the sequential test. Now, what that means in terms of the agenda is that reason for refusal number number 3 on page 77 of the agenda, in theory that could fall away. So in principle there is no objection from the Environment Agency, but it would be incumbent upon the local planning authority to apply something called the sequential test, which we have done for the other agenda item next door to this one on the agenda. So I'm not going to sort of draw conclusions about what would be the result of that sequential test, whether or not it would be passed or not. There is a possibility that it could, applying the same criteria, etc., bearing in mind that the next agenda item, the PDI site, the sequential test was applied to that and was passed. So that the best update I can give you is subject to a sequential test being applied by officers, that reason for refusal could fall away. At the present moment in time, we haven't applied that test because the consultation response was quite late in the day. In terms of other updates, we had an email from National Highways which refers to their holding objection to the application. So in summary, they have asked for further information, and within the report on page 23, right at the top of 23, we've reported to you that the holding objection expires on the 1st of April. It's not an April Fool's joke. It's actually the 18th of April. So there's a bit more time to run on that particular holding objection, on the subject of which earlier today the local planning authority received by email some modelling, some highways modelling. So again, it's far too early in the process to draw any conclusions on that, because we will need to consult with our colleagues, the local highways authority, and we will need to consult formally with National Highways. So, as things stand, the reason for refusal on the agenda related to insufficient information for highways still stands. However, there has been movement on that issue, and conceivably, in the passage of time, that reason for refusal could potentially fall away. But that's the update on that particular bit of modelling. There's been reference made already to late representations. So what we've done as officers, to keep it as simple and concise as possible, is give you the current sort of update as we understand it. And so in addition to, bear with me when I'm moving bits of paperwork around. Page 20 and 21 of the report, we refer to a petition of 600 plus opposing the application. We have had a petition in support of the application, which contains 163 signatures. And then in terms of the totality of objections, letters of support, the current total is from 154 representations received, there are 34 objections and 120 representations in support. One other update is you would have received a briefing pack, a presentation pack from the applicant, MD Star. They have referred in there to a document which has very recently been uploaded to the council's website, to the planning part of that, which is evidence which will support the new local plan, and it's something called an employment land availability assessment, and it's hot off the press because it was literally uploaded about three weeks ago. Now, within that document, and the applicant, I think, has prayed it in aid, if you like, there is reference to this particular site amongst others. I'm just going to call out what one of the conclusions of that piece of evidence for the local plan suggests, whereby at paragraph 5.5.14, it refers to 4 sites in the sort of Purfleet, West Thurrock area, and it specifically refers to this site. It acknowledges that there's a live planning application, and it suggests that these sites, including Mardyke Park, beg your pardon, are well situated to serve the market for employment premises in Purfleet and West Thurrock. Full stop. The council should consider allocating some or all as employment land. The point I want to make is that document is evidence which will inform the local plan. It's not the local plan. There's a process to go through. It's an option. There will be a draft of the local plan, we anticipate, in the summer, and then it will go through the various stages, and sites may or may not be allocated. So although the applicant has referred to it, I advise a hint of caution about that, and strictly speaking, the position should be as per the development plan, and you have employment policies within the development plan. So you have CSSP2 and you have CSTP6, and although in theory they countenance employment uses outside of the identified hubs, it's subject to caveats like being compatible with local land uses, etc., being compatible with highways, which are issues within the report. So that's just the update on that one there, because the applicant has relied on that, and I thought I'd just clear the air with that one. If you bear with me, I think that might be all the updates. Yep, I think that's it. I hope that's it. Presentation.
Yeah, Councillor Watson, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Can you just give me some clarity around the employment land assessment? What is your criteria within that to allow Greenbelt to then have employment land assessment put on top of it? And how does that impact onto the local plan that we've got currently? And how will we cover that in the local plan now?
Well, in terms of what's in front of what is development plan policy now, there are identified employment areas. So there are key strategic employment hubs like London Gateway, like Port of Tilbury. There are allocated primary and secondary employment areas, areas of West Thurrock, Purfleet, etc. And the policy at the moment, your development plan policy, says that employment generating use should be located within those areas. The policy does allow for some latitude away from that, but it's subject to other land use caveats, so it doesn't supersede Greenbelt policy. What that document does, the ELA, and there'll be another document called an EDNA, which is an economic development needs assessment, will look at the local plan period, so 10 years plus. We'll look at what our employment growth is, which sectors it is, and it will make it will bring forward evidence about where are the best sites. If we're looking about releasing new land for employment, where are the best sites, what the market is after at the moment, and we'll bring forward, if there's a need for more land to be allocated, it will bring forward those sites. But I think the point I'm trying to make is, although the applicant has referred to that, and although this document suggests that there might be sites in that part of the borough which could be brought forward, it's at a very early stage, and you should be careful about the weight you place on it. It could be the case, at the end of the process, there's need for release in that part of the borough, but we're not there yet. I think it's the simplest way of explaining that.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, if you want to start your report, thank you.
Right, thank you, Chair. In terms of the presentation, there we go. Bear with me, I've got to move some paperwork. Okay, so the application before you seeks full planning permission for employment generating uses. So that's Class B2, which is general industrial uses, and Class B8, which is storage and distribution. On that site there, so it's a site of approximately 13 hectares. Also proposes something called a community and workplace hub. There'd be a new roundabout junction on Ship Lane, and there'd be other elements such as a boardwalk, landscaping, etc., and ancillary development. The detail of the proposal set out within the tables at paragraphs 1.1 and 1.4 of the report. So if I whiz through some of the slides, that's the site. So to orientate members, junction 31 is bottom right-hand side. Ship Lane goes where my cursor is there, and then you can make out within the site there's that area there, which is an existing scaffolding business, which is lawful. It has certificates of lawfulness, and that would count as previously developed land. There are 3 residential properties within that area as well, and there's also a residential property down here on Artillery Road, which is within the red line. In the wider area, you've got the Mardyke, you've got Wattswood, which is a local nature reserve, a local wildlife site, so that's a non-statutory designation, but there are some areas of ancient woodland within there. And then to the south, you've got the built-up area. The site is in the Greenbelt. There are public rights of way. There's a public right of way which goes through the site adjacent to the Mardyke. There are overhead power lines which go through the site. It's in the high-risk flood zone. That's 3A. It's not 3B. The initial response from the Environment Agency put it in 3B, which is functional floodplain. It's actually not. It's in 3A, which is still high risk. I'm not downplaying it. It's still high risk. So I've mentioned the existing lawful commercial uses, and you've got some residential uses on the site. But apart from that, the site is open, and it's in the Greenbelt. The proposal, as I said, is for employment generating uses, and on that plan, it's probably best to point out that land to the west, so where I'm indicating here, to the north of Wattswood, isn't within the application site, but it's within the ownership of the applicant. And there are various proposals for recreational benefit, which are referred to in the supporting documentation. That's the local plan policies map. That all that's showing you is the site is very clearly in the Greenbelt, and the built-up area, the purple areas are existing employment uses to the south on the southern side of the Artillery Road. That's the site plan. So what you've got there, and I'll try and show as much as I can, the blue corridors are the overhead power lines, and obviously they're a constraint on development because you can't build right underneath the power lines in terms of buildings. So Ship Lane, there'd be a partial realignment and a new roundabout access where I'm indicating there. Vehicular access into the site, which would serve a variety of units, some of them fairly small and some of them quite sizable. So that on the southern side there, you've got some sizable units. Service yards, car parking areas, the usual paraphernalia you get with commercial uses. At the western end of the site, you've got a small car park which is proposed for the community building, and at the far west, where I'm indicating there, is a proposed community building. There's some detail about floor spaces and building heights within the report. It is EIA development. By that, the development is above thresholds where the environmental impact assessment regulations would apply. So the application is accompanied by an environmental statement, and that looks at a range of environmental topics like noise and vibration, landscape and visual, air quality, etc., etc. And if you look at the report, that picks up on the chapters within the environmental statement. Turning to the key issues, the site is in the Greenbelt, so as per usual, you need to go through a thought process and a series of questions. The first question is whether or not this is appropriate development in the Greenbelt. Now, I've mentioned there is some previously developed land at the sort of north eastern corner. And the MPPF national policy does allow limited infilling or replacement of previously developed land, but it's a relative judgment about what's there at the moment and what's the impact of what's being proposed. The impact of what's being proposed is clearly quite significantly greater than what's there at the moment in terms of buildings, so we don't think that that particularly applies. What I should do is actually go through the pictures as well. I've jumped to issues straight away, so bear with me. Too much information going on. That's the wider site plan. So you've got the commercial element, and then you've got the recreational benefits where I'm highlighting there. Some elevations, it's fairly traditional, modern logistics, general industrial. Cladding is proposed there to try and break up the mass of the buildings. You've got building heights referred to in the committee report. There are some smaller units. I know the trend in some parts of the borough, like London Gateway, is for increasingly bigger units. There are some smaller units here, units 4A to 4E, which would potentially appeal to a different market. Bear with me. And that's the community building, which is at the far western edge of the site. A series of pictures, so that's arterial looking west, so the site is on the right-hand side behind that hedge, and that's a fairly recently constructed employment unit, which is not in the Greenbelt. That's currently on the market as we understand it. Again, the site is on the right-hand side there, but that's just to show the relationship with existing uses to the south. That's looking into the site towards the PDL, and you can make out the pylons, obviously, which go through the site. The other thing to note there, the site is within the Mardyke Valley, so there is a change in levels down to the watercourse and then rising up towards Aveley. It's quite subtle, but you can just about pick it out there on that picture. That's Ship Lane looking towards the site, and you can make out the terrace of three residential properties which are in the site. They would be demolished by the proposals, and again you can make out the pylons. That's looking north along Ship Lane, so the site's on the left-hand side. So basically, where the cursor is where a new roundabout would be. Basically, that would be the access for the proposal, and that's looking in the other direction. So again, the roundabout would be generally in that sort of location. That's within the site, so you've got Wattswood on the left-hand side and the open land on the right-hand side. So that's looking towards where the recreational uses would generally be. Again, the pylons are quite a distinctive feature there, but apart from that, it's open greenbelt land. And this is where the built development would be. So we're looking back towards Ship Lane more generally. And you can make out, again, the open nature of the site. Not quite on the skyline there, there's a bund. So the site has a level of protection against flood, which is why it's not functional floodplain. And again, similar view, that would be across where the buildings are being proposed. And some pictures of the existing uses within the site. So that's concentrated on one particular corner of the site, and that's a scaffolding business, plus 3 residential units, which are lawful and count as previously developed land. So going back to the Greenbelt issues, apologies for jumping around there. First question you need to ask yourself is whether or not the development is appropriate in a Greenbelt. Despite there being some previously developed land, the relative impact of 45,000 square metres-ish of employment floor space is clearly of a different magnitude to what's there at the moment, so we consider that the exception within national policy doesn't apply, so you have to conclude it's inappropriate development. You then need to look at the effect on the open nature of the Greenbelt and the purposes of including land in the Greenbelt. We've concluded there is harm to openness. You've seen in the pictures it's a largely open site. Putting buildings there would affect openness in both its spatial and its visual aspects. And we consider there's harm to some of the purposes of including land in the Greenbelt to varying degrees, but we've set out in the report that purposes A, B, C and E would be affected. And the final question under Greenbelt you need to ask yourself is whether that harm, so harm in principle, harm to openness and any other harm, is clearly outweighed by other considerations such that very special circumstances would exist. Now the applicant's case for other considerations is from paragraph 6.35 of the report. They've brought forward 8 considerations or benefits which they think either individually or collectively would clearly outweigh the harm. There's an assessment within the report, and we've ascribed varying weights to those arguments. There are some positive benefits to the proposals, particularly in terms of employment benefits, but in summary, we've concluded that harm to the Greenbelt and any other harm, which I'll get onto in a minute, isn't clearly outweighed, and that is the policy test. Harm needs to be clearly outweighed. Turning briefly to highways and transport, that's dealt with from paragraph 6.99 of the report. Access would be via a new roundabout junction. Parking, we've had a look at parking and compared it to the up-to-date standards, and generally speaking, it's okay. The application is accompanied by a transport assessment, and that assesses things like construction impacts, so HGV movements during construction and during operation. During construction, generally speaking, the applicant's assessment concludes that subject to a SEMP condition, there wouldn't be significant impacts. In terms of operational impacts, so if the development was approved and built, the usual comings and goings, HGVs, visitors, workers, etc. The applicant's transport assessment suggests that the impact is negligible. However, the local highways authority and National Highways have raised queries. We have a current holding objection from National Highways. And put simply, we've asked for more modelling. So we remain to be convinced that impacts would be within acceptable limits. So, although the applicant has earlier today put in some modelling, it hasn't been assessed. It will need to be assessed, and we'd expect updated consultation responses from the relevant consultees. So, at the present moment in time, that reason for refusal on the basis of insufficient information holds. Whether or not it falls away in the passage of time is a possibility. It's no more than that. In terms of other issues, ecology, very briefly, I've mentioned Watts Wood is adjacent to the site. That's a local wildlife site. That's a non-statutory designation, but it basically says that the site has some interest and there's some ancient woodland in there. There would be some limited works to the woodland, but in the main, and that would be more management because it's quite overgrown in there. Ancient woodland does need management. If you leave it to its own devices, it gets a bit overgrown, shall we say. On the site, you would have seen it's largely open. There's not a lot of ecology interest. So in terms of protected species and habitats, there's not a lot there. So subject to condition, there are potentially no objections on that particular matter. Landscape and visual impact. So that forms a chapter of the environmental statement, and there's something called a landscape and visual impact assessment, which has been submitted. The Mardyke Valley, as I've mentioned, is a shallow valley, and it has sensitivity in terms of impact on landscape and visual receptors. The response we've had from our advisor is that there would be an adverse visual impact to some receptors. There's a public right-of-way which goes adjacent to the Mardyke, and then if you were a receptor on Ship Lane, you would notice the buildings. There's no getting around that. Now, obviously, the applicant has proposed mitigation, which is planting, in essence. That would take time to establish and wouldn't fully screen or block views of the development. So, in terms of residual impact, which is always the way that environmental statements look at impact, what's the impact? Is there mitigation? What's left at the end of that? What's the residual impact? There is residual impact here, and it would be adverse. So on that basis, our advisor does raise an objection to the proposal, and that is a reason for refusal within the report, except it's a matter of some judgment, but that's the advice we've had from our advisor who's professionally qualified on such matters. So that's the reason for refusal number 4. Briefly, layout, design and appearance. It's a modern design, modern appearance. If it was anywhere else in the borough, on one of our industrial estates, for example, there'd be no issues with layout or design or appearance. It just happens to be in the Greenbelt, so that's an issue to be resolved. Ground conditions, we have no objections subject to condition. Flood risk and drainage, I've mentioned the update from the EA. That reason for refusal could fall away, but it relies on the planning authority applying the sequential test. There are no issues with items such as archaeology or noise subject to condition. Air quality, there are air quality management areas nearby. They're detailed within the report at paragraph 6.181. And the application considers both construction and operational impacts. Subject to mitigation, again, we have no objections, and the Council's EHO hasn't raised an objection subject to conditions. Energy and sustainability, the development would achieve BREEAM outstanding, which complies with policy. It is sometimes difficult to get large format employment buildings to be BREEAM outstanding, but the applicant has achieved it. As a point of reference, most of the buildings at London Gateway Logistic Park are also BREEAM outstanding, but it's a higher hurdle to pass than, let's say, an office building. In terms of operation of the development, the applicant's submission aspires, I'm quoting here, aspires to achieve net zero. What that basically means is energy generation during operation would be produced on site through photovoltaics, through air source heat pumps. So, in essence, during operation, the development could be off-grid. Now, that is above and beyond policy requirements. So, on that factor alone, that commends the site. Bearing in mind climate change and the current problems we're all facing, that's something which should be recognised. Doesn't necessarily override Greenbelt in any way, shape or form, but it is some benefit. And socio-economics, just taking aside everything else, there would be jobs created here. There would be economic benefits, and we do have to recognise that, but you need to bear in mind Greenbelt and highways and flood risk and landscape and visual. But there are a significant number of jobs potentially if the development were to come forward. The applicant has also brought forward a package of obligations. They're reported at paragraph 6.206. They should be treated as indicative because we are not recommending the application for approval. And if we were to get towards that position, there would have to be a negotiation. So please treat that as indicative. The final issue, material issue, is those 4 dwellings. The development would lose 4 dwellings. The council cannot demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, and it can't demonstrate the 20% buffer we need as well. Members will be familiar with that from residential cases. So, speaking pragmatically, supply is also about retaining existing stock. So, there is a problem with losing existing stock, albeit it's 4 units and you'll need to weigh benefit against harm, but on a prima facie basis, this loses existing housing stock, so there is an issue with that. Putting all that together, and I'll just finish, there's a couple of visuals. Again, please treat those with a pinch of salt, because they're often engineered to look a certain way. Let's put it that way. So in summary, it's in the Greenbelt, there's harm. We don't think that harm is clearly outweighed, and that is the policy test. At the present moment in time, there's insufficient information for highways to draw a conclusion, so that's a reason for refusal. There are landscape and visual impacts which are adverse and cannot be mitigated. That's an objection, and there's loss of residential, which is an objection as well. Putting all that together before you, you've got a recommendation to refuse planning permission. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Obviously, I know this was part of a PPA agreement, so I know yourself and Jenna have been working very hard to, behind the scenes to get this application to us. I suppose my first question is around Greenbelt. So, obviously, looking at the very special circumstances, the applicant has come up with a whole host of reasons as to why they think they've mitigated against the loss of Greenbelt. So, based on Greenbelt solely, there's moderate positive weight, limited positive weight, moderate, limited, moderate. There's a lot there. In your professional opinion, were these on Greenbelt grounds, were they close to potentially overcoming that Greenbelt concern on the basis of the sheer volume of jobs, investment that would be brought, community assets, etc.? What was your thoughts there? Are they still far off?
Yeah, Chair, it's for the decision maker to weigh where that balance lies, and the decision maker are the people I'm looking at right now. So our advice is that you have a range of weightings, precisely where you put, and they're all positive as well. That's the other thing to say. So the arguments which are brought forward in that table, and I think there are 8 arguments, they're positive, but to varying degrees. I don't think personally there's anything there which is significant. So, for example, this committee has considered fairly recently residential proposals where, because of the council's demonstrable lack of housing land supply, we have to put significant weight on it. And we have to put significant weight on it because there have been appeal decisions in this borough where inspectors have said you need to ascribe significant weight. I don't think, so there are employment benefits, without question. You can't build that amount of floor space and there not be jobs and investment. And that aspect, the economic aspects or objective of sustainable development in the NPPF, you need to recognise. So of those items, the moderates there, for example, new employment, yeah, it's moderate, but you need to temper in the fact that we have elsewhere in the borough available employment land. Now, I know I've referred to the ELA, the document which has just been posted, and that's perhaps hinting that some of the employment sites we have are perhaps not what the market wants in terms of location. So you'll know, members will be fully aware we have a lot of consented employment land at London Gateway. We have an LDO because committee have been kept up to date on the LDO. That authorised 830,000 square metres of logistics and general industrial, and that is partly built out. And we're working on a new local development order to replace that. And that will be circa 640,000 square metres. We have the TEP proposal, the Thames Enterprise Park, hasn't got planning permission yet because the 106 is just getting towards the last knockings. That will give an outline for planning permission for, I can't remember how many 100,000 square metres, it's I think 300,000 plus square metres. So with that in mind, I think the weight you can, and those sites, one's consented and one's virtually consented, so the amount of weight you can apply to the employment benefits has to be tempered, because there are sites which are ready to go elsewhere. So it is positive, and it could be moderate, but in my view, it has to be tempered by the fact we have available sites elsewhere ready to go. Just briefly looking at the other things on that list, so that's page 47 of the agenda. I mean, the traffic calming, I mean, my colleague in Highways sitting next to me can wax lyrical about it if he wants, but this proposal would bring forward a roundabout. And we've referred to you previously about the issue with HGVs in Ship Lane and heading north, and the council's consultation in pre-COVID 2019, and the solutions which were offered, and at that time the preferred solution was a roundabout, and we have a roundabout now. Obviously a roundabout is needed to access the development anyway, but you could take the view that there's some wider benefit there. So we've recognised that, and we've put more than limited weight, we've put moderate weight on there. Some of the other stuff is only fairly limited. So reference to the Strategic Greenbelt Assessment, just like reference to the ELA, the Strategic Greenbelt Assessment will inform policy, but we're not there yet. So you shouldn't be putting much weight on that at all, and you shouldn't be putting much weight on the Strategic Greenbelt Assessment because we haven't drafted the local plan yet. The other thing I would say, which perhaps goes beyond policy, demonstrably beyond policy, is the carbon neutral. So we've recognised that, and in the presentation I recognise that goes beyond policy. So that's where it gets a moderate. I'm probably not going to give you the answer you want because you're the decision maker, and you've got to weigh these against harm. And if you wanted to put different weights on different things, that's in your gift to do it. But that's the best advice we can give at the moment. Happy to add to that if you want, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few more, but I'll ask one more and then open it up to other members. I'll just Councillor Watson as well. In terms of visual impact, obviously we're homing in that you're nervous that the impact that this site may have on the landscape in general. But I mean, at the moment, Essex County Council, they're at war with the National Grid over these industrial pylons that they're planning to install through Essex and East Anglia, based on the visual annihilation that they're going to cause. And this site actually does sit directly underneath these particular types of pylons. Very important national grid infrastructure. We're confident that we're being fair in turning around to these potential developers and saying, well, actually, we're worried about the visual impact when we've got these huge industrial pylons overhead. I mean, strictly speaking, they've had to rearrange their design around those pylons. So you're confident on that one? Thank you.
So the applicant has done a proper assessment. So before the application was ever submitted, we scoped the extent of the environmental impact assessment, and landscape and visual impact was identified as something which need to be properly considered. So what the application does within the assessment is look at the landscape, and it looks at viewpoints, and it makes an assessment about magnitude of impact, and it then proposes mitigation, and it makes an assessment about whether or not there's residual impact. And clearly, with a public footpath and users of Ship Lane, the applicant's own conclusion is yes, there's an adverse impact, and that's borne out by our consultee as well. It's in the answer I'm going to give you is it's a part of the balancing exercise apart from like everything else. So under the heading of greenbelt harm, what national policy says is as well as greenbelt harm, you need to consider any other harm. Now this is a harm. There's an adverse impact, but you do need to weigh it alongside everything else. So if you were to conclude that, let's say, the economic benefits were stacked high, and you saw that as something which is going to outweigh landscape and visual, it's in your gift to do that. But it's also incumbent on us as officers to say there would be harm. Now, if like any planning decision, if you're happy to accept that in the round, because overall the positives outweigh the negatives, then that's in your gift to do it. But I think the whole point of environmental statement and environmental impact assessment is so you're going into any decision with your eyes open and you know the full extent of the impacts and the mitigation and what's left at the end of it and residual impact. And there is adverse residual impact. You can't screen buildings this high. So those larger units, and I'm looking for the table with the building heights, I think they're up to about, they're up to about 18 metres. So that's clearly not as high as the pylons, obviously, but in terms of bulk and massing, there would be a quite different to what's there at the moment. But you do need to weigh it. So as long as you're going into any decision with open eyes, knowing that's an adverse impact and it can't be mitigated, you need to throw it into the balance.
Okay, I think Councillor Watson had her hand up. Councillor Watson.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Can we talk about flooding, please? That would be really good, because on this site, the horses tend to have like their own personal swimming pool most of the year round, and the fire brigade is normally called out to get them out. So what is they're going to be doing to mitigate the flooding, because it is a high floodplain in this on this development?
Okay, so The consultation response, which is reported from Environment Agency, which is on page 22, right at the top of 22, was a holding objection because they considered that the flood zone of the site was 3B. Now, 3B is functional floodplain, like parts of Tilbury Marshes. They're meant to flood. I'll get onto the site I think you refer to is probably the other side of Mardyke, the one which does flood and stays wet for a long time. This is on the southern side. So what we've reported to you on page 22 is the Environment Agency holding objection. It's within a flood risk category which is inappropriate. So what they were saying is they thought it was in 3B, and that's the worst, basically. Functional floodplain is meant to flood in certain events. And these types of buildings are de facto inappropriate, and you don't go any further than that. That's it, you don't approve them. The update is, and there's been a lot of back and forth between applicants, consultants and EA. I mean, we've seen some of the traffic, and it was almost every day. And there was all manner of modelling. And then we got to a position, third week in March, where the response from EA is an updated response, and it refers to all the modelling, submitted modelling, blah, 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 confirms the existing embankment, which I'll refer to, you saw in the pictures. There is an embankment to the immediate south of the footpath, which basically protects the site, and that's what the Environment Agency is saying. The existing embankment protects the site from flooding in the 1% plus climate change event, so that's one in a 100-year event. On that basis, they've reviewed the FRA and are now able to remove our objection. So, what they thought it was 3B, it's not 3B, it's 3A. It's still high risk for flood. But it doesn't kill the project necessarily, because if you look at the vast majority of our employment areas in Purfleet, in West Thurrock, London Gateway, they're all in the high risk flood zone. But it means there's a procedure to go through, which is we have to apply something called the sequential test, which is us being satisfied that there are no available sites which could accommodate that development, which are reasonably available at an area of lower flood risk, so zones 1 or 2. We need to apply that test, but the agency have changed their position from basically flat out, forget it, it's not going to happen, to it could happen, subject to applying the sequential test. The site you're referring to on the northern side of the Mardyke, which is in between the Mardyke and the site which the council runs, isn't it? I was going to say, I don't think it's a traveller site, isn't it? It's Travelling Showman, is it? Anyway, that site, periodically I drive past there, and at certain times of year, it's very wet. And this is anecdotal, so don't take this as gospel. What I think the issue there is there is some protection, but when it overtops, the water hasn't got anywhere else to go. And visually, from walking the site, the embankment on this particular site is quite a substantial feature, whereas whatever protections on the northern side is probably very little. What any application has to do, if it's accompanied by a flood risk assessment, is demonstrate satisfactorily that the development will not increase risk of flooding elsewhere. Now, I'm not going to try and go through the EA's response because it's like 5 pages, but they've reviewed the flood risk assessment and are now able to remove their objection. So I'm assuming they are satisfied that this development wouldn't increase risk of flooding elsewhere. Now, it wouldn't. No development is required to make things better for other people. It just simply doesn't work like that. But the development washes its own face. There would have to be a surface water drainage scheme. There'd probably have to be underground storage. There'd probably have to be attenuation of rainfall so that it's released at greenfield rates. So it wouldn't make the situation any worse. But this we haven't, subject to the sequential test, we haven't got potentially a reason to object to it on flood risk grounds. Now, I know it's increasingly a concern with, again, with climate change and all the rest of it, but that is the up-to-date response from Environment Agency. So it's going back to the update right at the start, subject to us applying the test, and we will need to apply the test, that reason for refusal could fall away. And that response indicates to me that the Environment Agency are happy that this development doesn't increase risk of flooding elsewhere. So it won't make any situation worse.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Steve Taylor, then Councillor Polly.
Thanks, Chair. Matthew, briefly, there's 3 questions I've got. One of them you mentioned in your presentation, which I have to say I thought was very well put forward and concise as it could be, given what the application is. You said about the site could, I like that word, could, be energy neutral. Am I right to assume that that's based on what it's used for, i.e. what the businesses that move there, what energy they use? So for instance, if it's a foundry, it's going to use a hell of a lot of power. If it's a warehouse, it's going to be a lot less. So there is nothing to determine as yet what those businesses might be, and therefore to say it can be energy neutral, it sort of seems to me to be a bit cart in front of the horse. Is that, what's your view of that?
Yeah, I think I was careful using the word could. So the applicant wants flexibility. Lots of applicants want flexibility. So they want the permission, which is for B2 and or B8. So it's general industrial or logistics. And you're quite right, there could be an enormous difference between the energy uses of an intensive industrial use as opposed to a warehouse. If you wanted my anecdotal opinion, the market for logistics in this part of the world, and not just this part of the world, because there are warehouse developments flying up on the 128 in Brentwood, and there are applications at Junction 29 at Brentwood, etc., etc. The market is quite intense for logistics at the moment. And there could be any number of factors. It could be post-COVID, it could be post-Brexit, it could be anything. Looking at it is an application for full permission, and they, to my mind, the floor plans, the elevations look like logistics. But you're quite right, if permission were to be granted, it could be logistics, but you could get 50% as B2. If a permission was forthcoming, we'd have to think of some sort of planning condition, which would, you've got to put me on the spot there. We'd have to think of some sort of planning condition, which would be it would have to be only potentially on the first occupier. They have to put in some sort of energy statement about what their predicted usage is, what they're doing in terms of PVs on the roof, air source heat pumps, and then we'll make a judgment about whether or not it meets 100% of their energy use or not. So I think I refer to the applicant's aspiration to be zero carbon. So it is an aspiration, and that's commendable with all that's going on in the big wide world out there. But nailing down the detail, you're quite right. Yeah, we would need to nail down the detail.
Thanks, Matthew. That was kind of my assessment of it, which is why I say I think it was a bit cart before the horse. So yeah, it's a good aspiration to have, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will be fulfilled. My second question, you talked about the bund wall that protects the site, going back almost to Councillor Watson's question. When you put the photograph up, it looked to me like there was a definite gap in that. I might be wrong, but certainly that was the visual that I saw. You remember the photograph that was on with a gap in it? Well, unless things have changed a lot since I did physics, that bund wall is about as much use as a chocolate teapot.
Yeah, and again, with the to and froing between the applicant's consultants and the Environment Agency, we always get caught in the middle, you know, trying to guess what's going on. As I understand it, and my colleague who's the case officer might put me right and kick me under the table, but as I understand it, at some stage in the past, there wasn't a bund there, but the site levels the site was scraped, which happens, and a bund was formed. And as I understand it, and this is anecdotal because I think I had a conversation with the applicant's agent. It might have been their flood risk. I can't remember. It all gets lost in the detail. But the conversation went along the lines of, at one point, the Environment Agency wanted access to the watercourse, and the bund was in the way. So the site owner agreed, I'll punch a hole in it so you can get your vehicle in, and it hasn't been replaced. All I'm going to do in terms of answer is go back to that Environment Agency response, which is they've looked at it, they've looked at the modelling. The modelling would have included topographic, so what are the levels of the site, which would have included the bunds, and they've taken the view that there's no objection. Now, whether or not that means they have to re-scrape a bit of the bund and plug it, I simply don't know. And whether or not, again, if members were considered that the benefits outweighed the harm, whether or not there'd have to be clarity on that point, and whether or not it's covered off in the flood risk assessment, which has been amended, I don't know. But yeah, it's a fair point.
That's fine, and I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going mad. And just my third one, and particularly as you brought it up, which saves me doing it later, was you mentioned the warehouse development on the 128, which falls within Brentwood. So that's of a significant scale as a visual in your head comparison with the size of what's being proposed. Similar kind of height, mass.
Are you referring to the one opposite on the Ontario Road, or the development which is going up in Brentwood?
I'm referring to the one that if you drove down the 128 to the halfway house, immediately before you get to the 127 on the left-hand side. So you come under the railway bridge. It's the last thing you see before you go up to the roundabout.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's chair. That's within an adjoining authority. But the reason I refer to it is in terms of there seems to be a very strong market for logistics at the moment.
But the question was, is that a similar kind of mass, one of those warehouses for what's being proposed as the large ones?
I couldn't confirm either way. I mean, if there is a very recently constructed warehouse on the southern side of the Arterial Road, directly opposite the site. I mean, we could try and dig out the floor plans on that. It would take 10 minutes, but I mean, again, anecdotally, the trend for logistics building is ever higher, and I mean, 18 metres isn't the tallest by any way, shape or form. So London Gateway, there's a 42-metre shed. And potentially Thames Enterprise Park with a similar sort of scale. Yeah.
It was just in case you happened to know, but I appreciate it's within Brentwood, so that's fine. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to Councillor Polly.
Thank you, Chair. And I will thank the officers again for a very detailed report condensed into a good delivery at committee. So thank you guys for that. What I have heard is that we as members know there's been a lot of traffic on this at the 11th hour, and some of the things that Officer has mentioned in their presentation have sort of added new considerations or possible new considerations into the application. If a decision was made tonight, could that be deemed unsafe in any way, that we've not given due consideration to the update information from EA and highways? I'm just thinking that something like this would possibly go to appeal, and I would want us to be as robust as we could if we've not taken proper consideration. It's just a consideration.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, part of the reason why it's on the agenda tonight is, and I think the applicant may have referred to it in their pack to you, we're encouraged by national policy for larger scale proposals, for more complicated proposals, to enter into, wherever possible, something called a planning performance agreement. So that's basically a project management tool. So it's an agreement between, it's not a legal agreement, but it's just an agreement, a written agreement signed between the planning authority and an applicant to say an application's coming in. Here's a timeline of when we anticipate going to committee, and it's usually the case that as we're throwing resource at the application, I'm not going to say fast tracking, I'm not going to say jumping the queue, but as we are trying to prioritise amongst any other things, there's usually a fee to recognise that. So with this application, we did sign a PPA. It doesn't affect the recommendation clearly because we're recommending refusal, but it's just a project management tool to get a timeline. The timeline for this application was always targeting committee in April. That's why we brought it before you, and I recognise you had some loose ends. The applicant knows there are loose ends. The applicant's agents knows there are loose ends. They knew we were intending to hit this committee. They didn't ask us to press the pause button or defer. You have reasons for refusal. One of them, as I've said, in terms of flood risk, if you want my opinion, there's a very good chance that'd fall away. But you have a loose end with highways, and at the present moment in time, we couldn't conclude either way. So that's a question mark. You have the Greenbelt one. To my mind, that's quite clear, and the judgment for you is quite clear. Do you think there is benefit clearly outweighing harm? Same as any other Greenbelt case we put before you. And you've got a landscape and visual impact, which you just need to be, you need to recognise that as a factor. If you were minded to approve it, you're going to be approving it with harm. But if you consider that all those benefits outweigh it, and you're taking a decision with open eyes, recognising that harm, that's the whole point of the EIA process. Just because there's an impact, and some impacts are positive. So I'm freewheeling a bit here, but so the environmental statement includes a chapter on socio-economics, and on that factor alone, there's benefit. Clearly, there's benefit. There are a lot of jobs, and there's a lot of investment. So impacts don't have to be adverse, but for landscape and visual, clearly there's an adverse impact, which you need just to be aware of when taking a rounded decision.
And thank you, Matt. That did answer my question.
Okay, thank you. Did Councillor Watson, did you have your hand raised? Then over to Councillor Shinnick. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Jeremy, so can I ask you a couple of questions about the traffic on the HGVs? So hypothetically, if this was passed, so start building out, how many HGVs, like traffic, are we looking to look at? That's one. It looks like everything is going up Ship Lane. There's no other way in apart from Ship Lane. I know they're going to build a roundabout, but that doesn't stop them going through Averley or the traffic round the M25, around the roundabout on the M25. Once that's done, what is the expectation of how many HGVs will be coming out of this to and from? Because once again, that will hit Averley. We're looking at 502 car spaces, like generally. That's a significant amount of cars that will also be there. So what's the mitigation? I know we're talking about a roundabout, but personally, you can turn left on that roundabout and go through Averley, and it's happening quite a bit. And also the traffic around the M25 roundabout going up to Ship Lane now is at normally a standstill. So can you just tell me some figures and questions around how much HGVs movements we're looking at and how that's going to work? Thank you.
Okay, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you how many HGVs. And at the moment, that's why we've obviously got a holding response in, because we're not totally satisfied that the development in terms of traffic impact, particularly on Aveley, if you like, they've obviously mentioned that the fact that they put it a roundabout, that's a potential mitigation measure. Ultimately, you need a junction to get out of that development, and probably the most appropriate junction to get out of that development is a roundabout. Now, they obviously mentioned that in the consultation previously. Aveley favoured a roundabout in terms of, you know, trying to deter HGV movements, but ultimately, the site itself, obviously, we could condition where the HGVs go. So we could condition that the HGVs have to go out via Ship Lane towards Junction 31. So in terms of that impact, but it doesn't necessarily, obviously, prevent HGVs coming in and obviously still going to Aveley. At the moment, obviously, there are, as we know, HGVs going through Aveley because Junction 31 to go to some of the developments is easier to get off than go via other routes. There is a weight restriction on there. Ultimately, at the moment, that is for the police to enforce. We don't have powers under the Traffic Management Act, and as far as I'm aware, our current application hasn't been approved for a test on those, and then initially that was going to be on the box junctions on Junction 31. So in terms of preventing HGVs, ultimately, other than from the site, obviously there would be a condition. So that means that ultimately if lorries from that site decide to ignore it, that would be a planning enforcement matter from that perspective. But it doesn't prevent them from going. I agree with you. In terms of the vehicles, again, the same thing. Because we're not really aware of how Junction 31 is going to operate with this development, and we're aware that one of the issues with Aveley at the moment is that people use Ship Lane, come down Romford Road, for instance, come down Purfleet Road, use Ship Lane to bypass a lot of routes to actually come here. So there is some extent of rat running through Aveley already by vehicles. Our concern is that potentially this development could, if there are problems at Junction 31 and if they're caused by this development, potentially add in to the current issues there, that their likelihood is that those vehicles could go, probably more than likely going to go out via Aveley than actually try and wait in queue at Junction 31. So until we actually have that full package, and as you said, that was submitted to us today, we haven't even had a chance to actually look at fully analyse the base model, and we've basically been given a package saying, well, we've analysed everything, and we actually haven't analysed their validation yet, so we don't even know if their model actually stands the test first before actually what we've been given, which is basically, well, when the development, it's going to be fine, but actually when you read a bit of the development, there's a little passage at the end of it, a summary saying, well, if it's a bit congested, then it's probably likely that people will take other routes. Well, that just speaks for itself. You know, the likely other route from the development is it's going to go through Aveley. And that's at the moment, we're not 100% convinced of the impact of this development on Junction 31 and obviously Junction 30, sorry, the two are very much interlinked. And also what that potential impact might be on. They've said that people in the main will probably go out by 31. Well, ultimately, I think we find that a bit difficult to understand. If there's problems at Junction 31 or there's a bit of congestion, whatever it is, the likelihood is they'll go out via Aveley.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Shinnick.
Oh, yeah. Matthew, could you tell me what the impact on the air quality will be?
Yeah, Chair. So there's a chapter in the environmental statement which assesses impact on air quality because there are air quality management areas close by. So it is a material planning consideration, and if you bear with me, I'll get to the right part of the report. So the assessment considers construction impacts. So that could be dust, it could be tracking out mud, but also emissions from construction vehicles. And then during operation, it considers impact on air quality from vehicle emissions. So it'll be NOx, nitrogen oxide, and particulates are the two factors where those air quality management areas have been defined for. So from paragraph 6.180 of the report, we've referred to, at the top of page 67, where the air quality management areas are, and a couple of them are very close. So the Thurrock Hotel is a air quality management area, 'cause it's right on top of the slip roads between 31 and 30, and you've got the hotel opposite as well. The Premier Inn is also an air quality management area. So, in summary, it is a robust assessment. So you've got a table on page 69, which looks at the impacts and ascribes a magnitude to them. So it's predominantly residential receptors. There are sensitive receptors, you'd expect them to be. And it looks at things like dust emissions, transport emissions during construction, and then the operational effects of transport emissions. And it also looks at ecological receptors, because some ecological receptors, because of nitrogen deposition, etc., they can be affected. So there are, looking at that table, the magnitude of impacts are basically minor with some negligible ones. So there are some minor adverse impacts. But what that table does is then look at mitigation. So if you have wheel washing, if you can control construction hours, construction routing, etc., you can mitigate that impact. So the table there suggests that the residual effect, so if you add the mitigation, what's left, the effects are negligible across all those receptors. And the response from the environmental health officer, who obviously, you know, we do have an air quality officer, and their response, which is at, I'll find it in a minute. Yeah, 4.10. There's no objection subject to conditions. So we would have a SEMP condition. I mean, touching back on highways, potentially we could have things like a lorry routing condition. Potentially we could have a travel plan condition. If you add those together on air quality, there's no objection.
Okay, thank you everyone for those questions for now. With that, we'll move on to speaker statements. And the first statement is a statement of objection, and that's from a Mrs. Jackie Maney, who's a resident in the area. And Jackie, you've got 3 minutes in which to present your statement of objection. Thank you. Press the mic when you're ready. Oh, when you're comfortable.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. I speak in objection to this planning application, which, if approved, would lead to the irreversible loss of Greenbelt and have a lasting detrimental impact on Aveley, Uplands and Wattswood communities. I will say from the outset, too, that the right vehicle for delivery of employment and industrial sites of this nature is via the local plan, and this document will be undermined by allowing this application. The proposed development site comprises Greenbelt. In this case, it forms a vital demarcation between West Thurrock and Aveley. If this application were to succeed, it would directly offend the very purpose of Greenbelt and would result in further urban sprawl between West Thurrock and Aveley. The area immediately south of Aveley and either side of Ship Lane is largely open space. The presence of large, highly impactful industrial buildings would destroy this open characteristic. This would be detrimental to the immediate area, which when travelling north gives way to a traditional village or small town aspect. I would ask the committee to protect both this vital area of Greenbelt and open aspect by refusing this application. I also object to the application on the grounds that it would add further pressure to the highways network and generate additional HGV movements. It concerns me greatly that at the time of the planning report's preparation, there was a holding objection from National Highways, and the Council's own highways officers have raised concerns. From a highways perspective, the applicant has clearly failed to demonstrate that this application meets the required threshold, and it should be refused. It should also be borne in mind that the application site is part of an area prone to flooding, being part of the Mardyke floodplain. Again, as at the time of the report's publication, the Environment Agency was in objection to the application. Those living in Aveley will know all too well that this area of land floods regularly, particularly in winter, and for this reason the proposed development is entirely inappropriate. Lastly, I must comment on the applicant's attempts to sweeten this application with scant offerings of community amenities. It should be noted that any benefit being offered will be largely detached and inaccessible for most Aveley residents. It in no way ties into the settled community and would in most cases require access via a car. As a resident of Aveley myself and someone who enjoys walking and outdoor leisure, I'm no way sold on the meagre recreation provisions in this application, and neither are the vast majority of those living in Aveley, Uplands and Wattswood. I urge the committee to refuse the application. At the very least, members should visit the area for themselves, following which I am sure they would conclude that there is no way to support this application, now or in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that statement.
Thanks.
And with that, I'd like to invite down another statement of objection, and that's Councillor Maureen Pearce from Aveley, who's the ward member. And Maureen, when you're ready, please, you've got 3 minutes in which to put your case forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The fact that in this report, 7 statutory consultees and officers make comments ranging from inadequate, needs revision, insufficient information, should tell the committee all it needs to know about this planning application. It's undercooked and is no position to be approved. I'm opposed to this proposal because these plots, like most of Ship Lane and Arterial Road, are viewed by developers as simple degraded scrubland. However, to Aveley and Purfleet folk, they represent our natural town boundaries, our natural floodplains, our traditional meadow spaces, our undisturbed wild green landscapes. This proposal is yet another one which boxes in our communities with light industrialisation. The fact is, we don't need any more logistic hubs and light industry in this part of Thurrock. To the south of Aveley and the A13 towards Purfleet, there is a huge warehouse capacity and industrial land. The Ocado Logistics hub at the bottom of Purfleet Road has decimated the character of this traditional road and rendered the properties at the end isolated. Ship Lane 2, which this site borders, is another traditional road with character, being degraded over time with permissions granted for pallet store operations, scaffolding businesses, and we've had heard tonight of a double assault on both sides of this junction by developers. This proposal strips back our quiet green spaces, our natural flood meadows, while adding more HGVs and traffic to the weekly congestions we get when anything occurs at Lakeside, the QE2 bridge, the M25 or A13. Also, we don't need further community spaces. We have them in Aveley Rec and on the uplands. We don't need yet another undeveloped proposal for HGV turntable thrown in for good measure. None of these are substitutes for the natural wilderness and the green belt we currently enjoy and wish to preserve. With so many flaws in this proposal and so many objections or queries from consultees, I implore the committee to refuse this permission. Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak, and the committee.
Thank you very much for that, Councillor Pearce. And then that takes us on to our last statement, which is a statement of support, and that's from Mr. M. Solder, and you understand representing the agents and applicant. Thank you. You've got 3 minutes once you start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. I'm here this evening to speak in support of the proposals at the Mardyke Park in my capacity as County Director of the Essex Boys and Girls Clubs, which is a post I've held for the last 33 years. The proposals are predominantly employment driven, and if approved will provide 703 direct jobs. Funds will also be made available to provide people with the skills to access these jobs, and the jobs will also benefit from the proximity of the development to the newly created Freeport. As you would expect, I'm especially supportive of the new £2 million community facility that is being proposed on the site. This will be enormously supportive to the young people of Aveley and Purfleet. It will also assist the youth groups we already support across Thurrock, which includes Bellis Park Cricket Club, Purfleet Youth Club, Chadwell St Mary Boxing Club, Linford Wanderers Boys and Girls Clubs, Seabrook Rise Youth Club, Gateway Boxing Club, and through the Essex Youth Trust we also support the Royal Opera House Youth Provision. The facilities at Mardyke Park will have an emphasis on recreation, leisure. It will include a multifunctional hall, a trim trail, sports pitches, and a dogs adventure playground. I attended the public consultation in advance of the planning application being submitted, and I totally understand that any development on the Greenbelt is a very emotive subject. But I also heard about the existing communities of Purfleet in Aveley and what they wanted for the next generation of young people to have. And these were opportunities for recreation, leisure and employment. Those in attendance that evening also talked about wanting a safe environment where HGVs do not need to access the centre of Aveley Village, and I believe that the Mardyke Park development responds positively to all these demands. I've also seen the information that has been sent to elected members in advance of this evening's committee meeting, summarising the proposals. This includes information related to the proposed legal agreement and what is on offer to Thurrock, and I believe £5 million towards local infrastructure is a very attractive package. The scheme is private sector driven. It provides a strong balance between economic growth and well-being. It offers real tangible benefits and has the full backing of my association, and more importantly the 300 people that have publicly come out in favour of the scheme. So I respectfully request that the proposals are recommended for approval. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those three speaker statements. So with that, obviously, we can go into final questions. I was going to float the idea of a site visit. Obviously, I emailed that a few days ago, potentially. Before we go to that, did anyone have any comments on that? Is there appetite there, or did you want to head into debate? So, Councillor Arnold?
Yes, Chair, thanks. Yeah, I do have an appetite to do that, actually. I mean, I've got concerns. I've got grave concerns about the Greenbelt aspect, along with highways. I mean, Councillor Watson there expressed her views very clearly, I think. I mean, I've got grave concerns about vehicles turning left going towards the village. You know, and I really would like to see the site on, you know, boots on ground and have a good tour around the site. I think we've learned from experience recently that in-depth, lengthy, well-informed site visits are very beneficial to decision making. So, I mean, I really do support that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, if you could second that, Councillor Arnold, is that agreed? Yeah. Did anyone have any comments before we went headed down to that vote, or for a site visit? No further comments? No. Okay. All right then. So, Ken, are you happy for us to move for a site visit? Vote, yeah? Okay, right, so all those in favour of a site visit, please raise your hands. Okay, that's unanimous, yeah? Okay then, right, thank you everyone. That was, yeah, a good debate there. We spent an hour and a half on that. Let's get that site visit going, and we can bring this back. I imagine, I think the first meeting after May would be probably June time, so we'll get that done. All right then, so thank you. That then moves us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is 22/01672/FUL Thurrock Football Club in Ship Lane, found on pages 81 to 118 on the agenda. And Matthew, I understand you'll be presenting that one. Thank you. Jimmy, would you like to vacate?
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Sorry, Matt, if you could just give Councillor Tandy. Thanks for reminding me. Ooh. Yeah, go ahead, Matthew. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Updates, not as many as last time, you'll be glad to hear. It's mainly representations which have been received which aren't reported in the agenda, so it's probably easier to give you the current total. So in terms of individual representations, the update from what is on the agenda is that there have been 276 representations in total, and they comprise 56 objections and 220 representations in support. In addition to that, we have had a petition received against the application, which contains 618 signatures. So that is the update with current state of play for representations. I haven't got any other updates, so I think we can go straight to the sort of presentation. Here we go. So the proposal has been brought before committee twice previously in 2021. So if I run through what's being proposed. So the site is opposite the site you've just been considering, on the eastern side of Ship Lane, and it's the site of the former Thurrock Football Club, which resigned from the league at the end of the 2017-2018 season, so the site has been vacant, and it also includes practice pitches, or former practice pitches, to the north, which are adjacent to the Mardyke, immediately south of the Mardyke. And that's just zooming in a little bit. We've turned through clockwise a little bit on that particular picture. There's an aerial picture. That's a current picture, so you can make out the red line includes the football stadium and the practice pitches, but you'll note that the description of the development report just refers to a change of use of the clubhouse building, which is there. There's a flat above the clubhouse, and the proposal is a change of use back to a clubhouse use. But the predominant element of the proposal is a new vehicle PDI, which is a pre-delivery inspection facility, which is in a location there. So that's the current aerial picture. Just for context, there's what the site used to look like when the football club was in operation. So you can make out the practice pitches to the north there. So the proposal is changing the use of the first floor of the clubhouse, which is where I'm indicating just there, and then a PDI, which would comprise a building, which is where I'm indicating just there, which would receive vehicles, inspections would be carried out, whatever modifications and upgrades and preparation would be carried out in the building, and a car park, which is about 1,200 spaces, which is in a position just there. What's also being proposed is various landscape improvements and an HGV turnaround. So access would be from Ship Lane, and what the applicant proposes is a turnaround facility for HGVs, roughly in a position just there. There'd be associated fencing. I've mentioned landscaping. And there's other reference to the detail at paragraph 2.1 of the report. That's an elevation of the proposed building, so it's part single-storey, part two-storey. Quite utilitarian, I think, is the best way to describe the building. And that's the floor plate of the building, so there's a two-storey element and then a main car preparation element to the building, and a series of pictures. So that's the site entrance as it is. That's looking south towards junction 31, so the site's on the left-hand side and also sort of behind where that picture is taken as well. And then we've got the southern boundary of the PDI element, so putting the clubhouse change of use to one side. So that's looking west back towards Ship Lane. Apologies for the low sun. That was taken last month, I think, or might have been in February. Again, you can make out the pylons because they were a feature of the site you considered a few minutes ago. It's looking due north, so towards the Mardyke. It's open land. It's within the Greenbelt. Not a lot else to say. And then looking back towards junction 30, which you can probably just about make out there, and the pylons which go across the site. And then there's a bit of a zoomed-in view back towards the Mardyke, and there is a recreational route. I think it's a National Cycle Network route, which is on the northern side of the Mardyke, which you can possibly just make out in the middle of the picture there. And again, a bit of a zoomed-in view looking back towards junction 30 and the A13, slightly elevated there. In terms of planning history, in 2021, this committee considered 2 applications for very similar proposals. So in essence, a PDI facility with associated car parking, fencing, HGV turnaround. And what was also being proposed at that time was reuse of the football stadium. Now that's referred to within the report. This time, reference to reuse of the football stadium isn't within the description of development because we've made clear in the report that isn't development requiring planning permission. What's before you for consideration in the report is the elements of development which require planning permission, which is the PDI and the change of use. So there have been 2 previous refusals and they're detailed in paragraphs 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3 of the report. And in September last year, we received an application quite similar, and officers exercise a discretionary power under the Planning Act to decline to determine. What that means is, if you've had 2 refusals and you get a 3rd application and it's of a similar character or nature, and it's within 2 years of the first refusal, the authority can decline to determine it. And what that's about is guarding against the erosion of objections to schemes. In the same way that if an application has been refused and dismissed and it comes straight back in, the authority can decline to determine. So it stops repeat applications. We got to the situation where this application was submitted in middle of December, I think. And as the first refusal was timing out in February, we took the view, by the time we got to a recommendation, there would only have been 1 refusal within 2 years, and so we accepted the application. But that explains why there's a 3rd application which never got anywhere near this planning committee. It's also necessary to point out there is a links application which is referred to at paragraph 2.9 of the report, and that's the next item on the agenda, which is associated with this application. It's the same applicant. The site is in the Greenbelt. The site is in the high-risk flood zone, so that's 3A, but not 3B. So similar to Mardyke Farm, which you've just considered. So in terms of the issues before you, again, it's in the Greenbelt, so you have to go through the arguments about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Change of use of a flat is appropriate. The building is already there. There's no additional harm. However, the PDI facility, which is built floor space for commercial use, and a large car park clearly has an impact on Greenbelt, doesn't meet any exceptions in the NPPF and your own policies, and is inappropriate development. So you then must consider the extent of the harm, so visual harm, spatial harm, harm to greenbelt purposes, and we've concluded that there is harm, and harm to 3 of the greenbelt purposes to varying degrees. National policy says you have to put substantial weight on that harm. That's a direct quote from the NPPF. So the next consideration before you, as per the previous application, are there considerations which clearly outweigh the harm such that very special circumstances could apply. Now, they are listed at paragraph 7.25 of the report onwards, and there's an assessment from paragraph 7.27. They're summarised at the table at paragraph 7.54. Now, some of the factors are the issues which were raised previously in 2021 by this committee, and some of the factors are new factors. But we've been through the weight we think should be ascribed to those factors, and you have a range of weights which are set out in that particular table. There is some positive weight, but it's limited, or indeed very limited. And we suggest a couple of the factors are either negligible or no weight at all. So our conclusion is harm is not clearly outweighed. That's the same conclusion we reached in 2021. Therefore, it follows that very special circumstances don't exist. Therefore, you have a reason for refusal based on Greenbelt. In terms of highways, again, National Highways and the Council's Local Highways Authority are consultees, because we have HGV movements from Junction 31 to Ship Lane, and that needs to be assessed. The application is accompanied by a transport assessment, but subject condition, there are no objection on highways. We've referenced the design of the building in the report. Members will be aware, because officers have to advise that national policy requires that new developments have to be beautiful. That's the word which is used. I've shown the elevations of the building. Let's say the visual appearance doesn't weigh in favour of the proposal, and it in fact is referred to in the reason for refusal. In terms of flood risk, it's in 3A, it's high risk. The applicant has put in information to inform a sequential test. So what basically means they've looked at, are there sites which are available in the local area or close to main roads which would be of the size required, and are there any sites of lower flood risk? And there aren't any. So we've applied the sequential test and it's passed. So there is no flood risk objection on this one. So we've gone, unlike the previous application, we've gone the stage further and actually applied the test. So there's no flood risk objection. In terms of other matters, again, subject to conditions, there are no objections on it. So we come back to Greenbelt. We come back to consideration of the factors promoted by the applicant, which is summarised in the report, which are to a degree the same as factors considered before by this committee, with some additional factors. We've concluded in the round that only limited or very limited weight can be ascribed to some of those factors, and indeed no weight can be applied to one or two of the factors. In the balancing exercise which you need to undertake, we're not satisfied that harm is clearly outweighed. And again, I'm going to emphasise the word clearly. Therefore, you have a recommendation to refuse planning permission. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much for that detailed report there, Matt. I've got one hand raised. If you don't mind, Councillor Arnold, I'm just going to jump in with a few questions and then I'll hand over to yourself. So the first one, Matt, is obviously these developers, they own the stadium. They're obviously keen to produce their PDI facility on the current football pitches. I suppose, hypothetically, I'm interested to see why the developers have not applied to put the PDI centre on the stadium, because strictly speaking, they could potentially knock down that stadium as previous developed land and then build the PDI centre there. And have you had any conversations with the developers about that? Because obviously, we, in that scenario, would lose a stadium and would just be ended up with derelict football pitches. Thank you.
Yeah, Chair, no, we haven't had any conversations about that as a proposal, but from recollection, and I haven't got the report in front of me, the second report which went to committee in summer of 2021, I think the applicant or the applicant's agent was suggesting there's a fallback position which would have been developing on the stadium site, which could have involved demolition and new buildings. The policy test is in the MPPF. So it could be the case that the existing football stadium, because there are buildings, there are hard standings, and various structures, it could count as previously developed land. But there's a policy test in the MPPF, which is about the relative impact. So you can either partially or completely redevelop PDL, but it's subject to the caveat about the impact. So if the impact is greater, the impact of redevelopment is greater than what's there, then it doesn't pass the test. We haven't had an approach. If the applicant were to make an application tomorrow, we'd need to apply that test. So it's a relative judgment about what buildings are on site, what's their footprint, what's their spread, what's their building volume, what's their building envelope, how does it sit visually, and if they were to come down, how does that compare with what's being proposed? Again, in terms of footprint or floor space or volume or character or spread of buildings, that sort of thing. But we haven't, at the present moment in time, we haven't had any approach about a planning application on involving development on the stadium site.
Thank you. And one last question. I mean, a PDI centre, obviously, pre-delivery inspection, obviously an incredibly important part of the process before cars are sent out to the UK road network. The building itself, I mean, effectively is designed there to block out sunlight because obviously in that final stage, they may have sort of paintwork to it. So strictly speaking, I mean, the building's always going to be, it's going to be difficult to make that building attractive based on the nature of what pre-delivery inspection vehicles go through when they're going through their final stages. So in that sense, what you would like the building to be more attractive?
I've shown you the elevations, and I can probably find out what the proposed materials are from the application form. I suspect it's a clad build, so it's a steel frame, and it will be clad because that's the nature of how those buildings are constructed. Now, if you wanted my opinion, that building could appear better. There are ways of using contrast colours, laying cladding horizontally and vertically, so you get things like shadow play. If there's there's an office element, I think, to the building, so you can think about different approaches to appearance for that. But in terms of what's in front of us at the moment, I said the word utilitarian. I don't think it does any favours for the application, and it is referenced in the reason for refusal because there is a public right-of-way on the northern side of the Mardyke, and although the applicant, again, is proposing landscaping, that takes time to establish, so there could be a visual aspect about how that building appears in the greenbelt. If the applicant were to think about elevations and think about appearance and think about how could they enliven it and revise the plans, we'd be happy to consider that particular matter. I mean, I'll take your point about there could be processes within the building which require it to be dark, but there's quite a lot you can do with approaches to cladding, for example, to enliven a building. Now, I did mention the MPPF says that development has to be beautiful. I mean, that is the word which is used. Sometimes it's difficult to get commercial buildings to look beautiful. You know, we live in the real world, but you can make genuine attempts to do that. I'm not convinced the current building does that. It could be revised.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. As councillors, about 2 months ago, we received an email from Grant Greatrix, who's our Sports and Leisure Policy and Development Manager. In that email, he tried to arrange a meeting with councillors because it was acknowledged by Sports England and the national governing bodies that Thurrock has a significant shortfall in terms of artificial frigid pitches. On that basis, we're looking on page 109. No weight has been given to the potential of a 3G pitch at Bellas Park. any sort of conversations there between yourself and that particular department? Because I would have thought if there is a significant shortfall, the provision of a 3G pitch would have some weight. Thank you.
For the next item, we have a consultation response from Grant Greatrix, which I can report, but it is in reference to that particular application. So we've got a situation here. We've got two linked applications, and we're dealing them consecutively. If you can hold that thought, we will come to it on the next item. The reason why we've said provision of a 3G pitch at Bellis shouldn't carry any weight is basically because if you look at the consultation response from Sport England, which is on page 91. They're a statutory consultee, so we have to consult them. And their response is a holding objection. Further information required to consider the mitigation. So it's the point about mitigation. And I know the pitches aren't being used and haven't been used for a little while. But in the mind of Sport England, they still count as playing fields. And the key term is mitigation. If you're mitigating an impact, then my view is you shouldn't be ascribing positive weight to that. You're consuming your own smoke. You know, you're washing your own face. You're having an impact and you're mitigating the impact. Should you be ascribing positive weight to mitigating the impact? The view of planning officers, no, you shouldn't do that. And in terms of Greenbelt, I'm not aware of many cases where mitigation has been held to be a positive benefit. So that's Sport England's position. And I know, there are obviously people in the gallery and, they've got eyes and they know what the site looks like. But in terms of the Sport England response, we have to consult them. They're a statutory consultee. That's their holding objection. And they have clearly mentioned the word mitigation, as indeed the applicant's planning statement mentions the word mitigation. So if you're replacing the loss of former pitches with a 3G, and you're saying that's mitigation, should you be putting positive weight on that as a factor in the Greenbelt balance? Our opinion is no.
Okay, thank you. Right, there was a few hands raised there. I'll go to Councillor Arnold, who's been waiting patiently, Councillor Mays, Councillor Watson, then Steve Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Matt. Very good report. I've got kind of like two questions to ask. I'll deal with the first one first, obviously. Yeah, it's just the PDI Centre, just sort of turning around, just getting to it's the 1,204 vehicle spaces. Now, I kind of suspect that Group 1 Automotive, the joint applicant, I mean, their whole business model will be to get vehicles in, get vehicles out as fast as possible. So actually, it's just building up to another question, actually. Now, do you have, and if this is in the report and I've missed it, please forgive me, and this will apply to the second question. Do you have any idea of what Group 1 Automotive's plan is for vehicle turnaround? So for one vehicle entering the site, how long would that be within their plan to turn that vehicle around as an average, get that back out and get it replaced? Because this is going to be done 1,204 times. And I do, like I say, I do suspect that they'll be shifting them as fast as possible. So I'd be interested to know if you've got a figure on that. And that also then relates to the HGV aspect to that as well, because I think these things, they can carry maybe 10, 12 vehicles. I'm really not too sure on that. And obviously that sort of pro rata, that goes up to HGV vehicle movement as well. So can you answer that one for me?
I think, Chair, between us we'll try. On the turnaround, I haven't got an answer on that. Now, the view I take is there's a design being offered and a layout being offered in the application, and that proposes circa 1,200 car parking spaces. So I would have thought the architect would have talked to the client and assessed their needs and taken a view about what's the maximum capacity. And obviously, I can't remember which months have new licence plates. It's twice a year, isn't it? So what they're factoring is, at those peak times, twice a year, what's the maximum stock? And they've designed it on that basis. But in terms of turnaround, I'm guessing that any business wouldn't want stock hanging around out in the open for considerable periods of time. But it's, again, market-driven, market conditions and all the rest of it. That's about the best I can offer. I don't know if my colleague's got a view on the other matter.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we did. So what they've done in their transport assessment or transport statement is that there is a PDI centre somewhere around the M25 that they already have that's close to, I can't remember what junction it's close to, but it's limited to this principal idea. So that in the same way, it receives lorries from a number of the ports, unfortunately not local ports. Both ourselves and National Highways have looked at what they've put forward in terms of the PDI centre, which is of a similar size that operates there. And in terms of the number of, there's a split in the type of vehicle movements. So some will come and go on big transporters, like you said, 10 to 12, maybe 8 vehicles. Some will go on smaller. So when they go out, they'll go out on smaller transporters as well. So some will go on three transporters. Some will go out with drivers, so it will go out as a single car. In terms of where we looked at it, and in terms of where we'll condition it, in terms of that, we will be conditioning it such it all goes out to junction 31. So obviously National Highways in that respect had a big say-so in this, because obviously if you look at where they're coming from, they're coming through junction 30 to 31, and they're coming off from the south to junction 31. Similarly, the vehicles are going out to places in Kent, places in Essex, so that in reverse, there's obviously a slightly larger number of vehicles going out than coming in, because there's obviously there's bigger transporters coming in than them going out. But in terms of what we looked at, in terms of the impact, and that includes the testing, so the vehicles will be, a number of cars will be tested daily. From my recollection, I can't remember offhand what it was, but we've agreed a route, and that route is principally on the strategic network. So it'll be round junction 31, down Stowness, along the Purfleet bypass, back along the arterial road and back into the site. So avoiding Averley in terms of where they'll be testing the cars. That will be set as a condition, as will be where the lorries will go, as will be where they come in as well. So that routing will be into Ship Lane. There will be no lorries. But again, as I said, with the other development, we can't prevent them. That if they did occur and going through Averley, then that would have to be a planning enforcement matter. But it's something we condition. We've looked at it, and in terms of the movements, and as Matthew's actually purported to, there are 2 times a year when there are significant amount of vehicles that they pass through. So in terms of the scenario, we've looked at the worst case in terms of what that traffic impact, and both National Highways and ourselves consider that in terms of the vehicle numbers, it's not going to have a significant difference. And also in terms of employees, you're talking about a small number of employees as well in terms of compared to the site opposite, and in the round, that's not having a significant impact on junction 31. It's got to the level where you wouldn't even consider doing an assessment. So in terms of signal assessment or junction queues or whatever it is, what we've done is we asked them to do basically traffic distribution diagrams with the number of vehicles, and that number of vehicles is so low in terms of its overall impact in terms of the number of vehicles that are currently using that part of the network that from our point of view we couldn't object.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I don't want to labour the point. Yeah, all I'm trying to sort of make clear is 1,200 vehicles. I kind of suspect that the operator would want to move them vehicles at least once a week. So we are talking a significant amount of vehicle movement, which just brought me on to another point before I get on to my final question. Are there going to be any restrictions on hours of trading? Because this could very rapidly go to 24-hour trading.
Yeah, bear with me, Chair. I'm just trying to look at the through the report to see what we've got. I mean, the point, it is, the applicants make the point, there's no members of the public should visit, but I'll let Julian explain the other.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add to that. In terms of lorry movements, basically we've said no lorry movements before 9:30 in the morning and none after, I can't remember what time it is in the evening, and also the restriction on the times that the vehicles can be tested on the network. So in terms of lorries movements, particularly, they will be outside the peak time. So they won't. They could be, you know, but they won't be during the peak times.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I mean, obviously, before I move on, just my last point really, and maybe it's just worth just pointing out if it's conditioned, if it gets that far, the preparation unit, I'm kind of suspecting that there will be some fairly heavy-duty vehicle paint refinishing and repair going on in there. It is in this side of the business, it does generate lots of body repair. That's why they have to go somewhere for it to be done specifically for the turnaround to move on. So all I'm going to say is the building, is there any conditions on the building for its usage? Because obviously there's going to be a lot of paint, fumes, etc., coming out of there. And have you taken into account that if there are paint facilities within it, they will need quite tall chimneys, in effect, to actually get rid of that paint fume? And I'll leave that there.
Chair, just picking up that point, as we understand the submission, it's new vehicles before they're delivered to dealership. So I don't think there'd be an element of repair, or there's nothing to suggest in the application there would be repair. So I do take your point. Panel beating, spraying has implications for noise, air quality, etc., etc. But as we understand it, it's receiving new vehicles from 4 ports: Sheerness, Avonmouth. I can't remember the other 2. Quite far north. They'll be brought into the site, prepared as new vehicles for delivery to showrooms. Now, I don't imagine that would involve anything significant in terms of modification, and you've heard about the road testing. So I don't. The best information I have is not a repair facility. If, and again, a big if we were in a position where members decided that the benefits clearly outweigh the harm and we were looking at potentially a different resolution, we haven't even thought about planning conditions. And there would be a whole host. But our recommendation is fairly clear, so I'm not going to start going into that.
Okay, I mean, just to close, I mean, I do come from a place of knowledge on this, and you would be amazed the amount of vehicles that require paintwork prior to their new sale.
Sorry, could I just interject? As somebody who lives opposite a port that does exactly this and imports vehicles, they're predominantly wrapped so that when they're shipped, the sea air doesn't affect the paintwork. The PDI at Purfleet Deep Wharf effectively is unwrapping and polishing them. They're not, to my knowledge, there's very little painting or spraying that goes on. It is effectively valeting and unwrapping the vehicles. That I don't know if this is the same operation, but that's the experience we've got in Purfleet on Thames. Just to give you some, if that helps you at all, Councillor Arnold.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Polly and Arnold for that. Right, that takes us on to Councillor Mays, Councillor Watson, Steve Taylor, and if there's no further questions, we'll move on to statements. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to ask a question on this weighting and the Greenbelt weighting, because I saw on there that the gifting of Thurrock Stadium to Grays Athletic Football Club for use of community football is very limited positive weight, and I just wondered how you came to that conclusion, please.
Chair, it's the same conclusion we reached last time, and it goes back to the point I made in the introduction. The football stadium is there, and reusing a football stadium, which is already there, it is not development in the planning sense of the word. So development is described by a section of the Town and Country Planning Act, and reusing something which is already there is not development. The description of the proposal makes no reference to reuse of the stadium. So the applicant, clearly the applicant is using that in their argument, and who can blame them? But I've got to narrow it down to planning considerations. What are the elements of this proposal which need planning permission? It's the change of use of the flat of the clubhouse, and it's a PDI. So reuse of something which is there, albeit it's been vacant for several seasons, it could happen tomorrow. And now obviously the applicant, and no doubt their speaker statement will refer to their arguments, but in planning terms, in simple planning terms, you don't need a planning application, you don't need a planning event to reuse something which is already there. So that's why the weight has to be constrained.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted some clarity on that one because I wasn't on the committee at that time. So my next one was about HGV, the weighting given to HGV turnaround. And I know in the last application it was moderate positive weight because it was about stopping HGVs trying to go through Averley. I just wondered why this one was limited and the other one was moderate.
This is where we've got the issue of separate applications have to be considered separately. But the application you've just considered and this application both have responded to an issue whereby the council undertook a public consultation in 2019 through the Highways Department because there was an issue with errant HGVs travelling north along Ship Lane and getting stuck at the mini roundabout. And there were options being promoted at that time, and the preferred option, and my colleague will know all the details, but the preferred option was a roundabout solution. What you had on the previous application was a roundabout solution. Now, arguably, because of the nature of that development, it's a bigger site and more development, you would need a roundabout. But in Greenbelt terms, we added a bit more weight to that particular solution because it was identified as a preferred solution and there was wider betterment. In terms of that consultation, the HGV turnaround is, let's say, suboptimal. It's still a solution, but it's not the top tier solution. Therefore, we were mindful of two applications next to each other on the same committee, and some of the factors being promoted were replicated. But we have been careful about for the same factor, if you apply it for one site and you apply it for the other site, the weighting may be different. In this case, we think it is different. You've got the top tier solution and you've got a slightly less optimal solution. That's why the weight is slightly changed. Julian's ready to go.
Thank you, Chair. I would say that from a highways point of view, although it's difficult to refuse, we don't feel that the option that they put forward, the PDI, will be effective enough, because obviously the lorries will come up to it. You've got to go round a roundabout. Potentially that might work. Here, you're just going to come up to it. It's going to be on your right-hand side. Will you go round that facility, which is actually offline? It's not online. The likelihood is an HGV would probably go on straight forward. So from a point of view, we don't see it as a great mitigation measure in that respect in terms of highways. It's there, it's a feature, but it's not necessarily, from our point of view, being effective, but it's not necessarily a reason for refusal, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go Steve Taylor then. Oh, sorry, Councillor Watson. Steve Taylor then.
Thanks, Chair. So I feel like a bit of a broken record right now, but the floodplain is even worse than the other side. So what's the mitigation around the floodplain as one? Bear in mind it's by the Mardyke, and we know that floods regularly anyway. The second one I want to ask you about is there is supposed to be Japanese knotweed sitting on that site. And if it is, how are you going to deal with that and how do they monitor that? Because it is quite a nasty species. Sorry, Steve, about that one. So could you give me, and I am also really concerned with the level of HGVs that's going to go in and out of that PDI centre. I think it's an absolutely huge building for not many jobs either. So can you just give me confidence that how this will work, bearing in mind if we took the worst case scenario of the Mardyke opposite happening, this one happening, we already have the Dartford crossing at least shut three times a week in the winter and a couple of and backs all the way through to Averley. And then can you also tell me who will actually enforce the measures that the HGVs actually go where they're supposed to go and not head up through Averley Village? Thanks.
Deep breath. Okay, the site is in the high risk flood zone. It's 3A. There's no ifs or buts about it. So we have to consult the Environment Agency, and the application has to be accompanied by a flood risk assessment, which have both happened. The Mardyke is a main river as well, because it drains. You know, its catchment is quite extensive and extends all the way up into Havering, and it comes out at Purfleet, so it's quite a wide catchment. So, response from the Environment Agency. I'm looking at the wrong report, isn't it? It's late in the day. Yeah, initially there was a holding objection, so it's similar to Mardyke. We had a subsequent consultation response removing that, subject to the sequential test, which is covered in the report. So the Environment Agency, as the statutory consultee, are satisfied that although it's within the high risk flood zone, subject to the sequential test, there'd be no risk of flooding either to the site, and of the point I mentioned earlier, the flood risk assessment has to demonstrate satisfactorily that any development does increase flood risk elsewhere. So the statutory consultee are satisfied it ticks those boxes. There would still be, and again it's if we were in a position where you wanted to go with a different recommendation, it doesn't mean to say things like a surface water drainage strategy would need to be agreed, potentially even foul water for that matter, so that surface, because you've got an extensive car park, there's no beating about the bush, you've got an extensive area of hard standing, where at the moment you've got natural grass. So there would, at the very least, need to be some sort of strategy about how you deal with surface water and how you either hold it on site or release it so there's no increase elsewhere. So there's no sudden deluge running into the Mardyke and causing problems downstream, for example. So it's a relevant point. At the moment, we have no objection. It doesn't mean to say that there wouldn't be conditions, because it's highly likely there would be conditions. We're not recommending the scheme, so we haven't got to that point yet. But straight back answer, we haven't got a flood risk objection from our statutory consultee. Japanese knotweed, yeah, it's an invasive non-native species and it can cause problems. I mean, it pops up periodically on sites in the borough, in my experience. If there was a different resolution, we would be into conditions requiring full detailed surveys and measures to eradicate, and then further monitoring as well, because it can come back. So that would be a longer term condition. So potentially it could be dealt with. It wouldn't stop development occurring, but it would mean the applicant would be on the hook for resolving planning conditions to our satisfaction, and the borough's ecology officer would, is familiar with Japanese knotweed, because I know it's turned up on sites in Purfleet, for example. So there's a process to go through, and that rightly needs to be gone through. On HGVs, I'm going to pick up on one thing you said, which was, and correct me if I'm wrong, you made a point about the number of HGV movements, and then you made a link to the number of jobs. We have referred to that in the report in terms of the economic benefits. So, like any employment generating application, be it in the Greenbelt or be it not in the Greenbelt, the applicant will of course refer to job benefits, inward investment, and they'll say the definition of sustainable development within the NPPF, there's an economic aspect to it and we're making a contribution. I think it's fair to point out, and we have made reference to it in the report, the potential number of jobs for the site, full-time operational jobs, for the amount of land take. Let's just compare it with the site opposite the road, which you've just considered. One site, which albeit is bigger, is 13 hectares and delivers a level of jobs, and the current site, which is 3.7 hectares, delivers a level of jobs. And if you were to sort of pro rata, this doesn't deliver, because of the nature of the operation, the extent of jobs and economic benefits which the other site does. So the point you're making about HGVs, and Julian can talk to that point, per economic benefit, if you like, is something you might want to consider in your deliberations. But we have made that point in the report about this site being a 1,200 square metre building in a 1,200 space car park with up to 30 full-time jobs, which if you were to adopt an employment ratio for logistics or for Class B2, that would be quite low benefit for the size of the site. But the point about HGVs, I think Julian can... Oh, there was one, sorry Julian, there's one more point. Correct me if I'm wrong again. I think you were making a point about cumulative impact. Right, so the first application you had was accompanied by an environmental impact assessment. And an element of an environmental impact assessment is an assessment of cumulative impact. So what it does, there will be a chapter in that EIA which looks at existing or approved development of a significant scale, and it has to make an assessment about the impact of the proposal plus the others. What's the cumulative impact? With this application, it's not EIA, it's not big enough, it's below the triggers, so there wouldn't have been that formal cumulative assessment, and we haven't, we're not approved yet. It's not existing, it's not approved, so it falls below that threshold in terms of environmental impact assessment. It doesn't necessarily stop you considering in the round the effects broadly, but it's each on merits, of course, as with any application. So I've talked in the round there, but I've just picked up on the 2 points you made.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the HGVs, it's a similar to the Mardark site. Obviously, we would insist on conditions in terms of movements. They have assessed that all the movements will be by junction 31 in terms of their traffic impact. But again, you know, it would, if it does decide the lorry wants to come through Aveley or come that way because of issues on the M25 or whatever it is, ultimately going through the weight restriction is a police enforcement matter. As I explained about the Traffic Management Act, we don't have the powers under the Traffic Management Act to do any enforcement in that respect at the moment. And otherwise, obviously, you set the condition, it would be then down to the planning enforcement team to take the appropriate action if it was being persistent, if you like. So there is no guarantee that a lorry wouldn't go off-piste, if you like, but we can only do the best we can in terms of what we put in on, and that's conditions in the lorry routings. As I said, we've conditioned that where the vehicles go for their test drive.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for those answers there. Just checking our time, it's 8:15, so I'll suspend standard orders till the close of play, if that's agreed. Yeah, excellent, thank you. Okay, so with that, we go on to Steve Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. You drew the short straw tonight, didn't you, Matthew? Without a doubt. So I wonder if you could go back to the picture that you showed from north of the Mardyke looking south. Do you recall that one? Or that one would do. Yeah, so if you sort of imagine reversing that, when you look at that view there, that looks like a very nice open piece of countryside. It demonstrates all the points you've been making about harms of the green belt. Because what you're talking about here, I think, is putting up a fairly standard box-type building that's going to take up a large part of that. So it doesn't go all the way to the Mardyke, does it? It's just the red line area.
In terms of the building,
yeah,
it's a more limited footprint, and it's probably towards the southern side of the site. So it's a good distance from that particular. So the vantage point you're referring to is on the southern side. Sorry, north, south, east, west. On the northern side of the Mardyke, because there's a national cycle route, and I've walked it, and yeah, you can get a view back towards the site, but the building would be set back from that. But you've got a hard standing, and you'd have fencing, and although the applicant, again similar to the first application, although the applicant is saying they can mitigate with planting, well, planting takes time to establish, etc. So there is a, to the Greenbelt point, we think there's a visual impact on openness.
Thanks, Matthew. And the reason I wanted to see the picture again was just to remind myself of what that looks like as it stands, and because that would largely be destroyed as a view going forwards. So you mentioned earlier about the suggestion that the PDI centre could be moved south to the current, if you like, brownfield part of the site, potentially.
Yeah, I think there was the chair and I'll respond to the question here, but yeah.
Okay, so just off the top of your head, and this is like a quick cigarette packet job, but if you were to move the footprint of the proposal on top of the footprint of the current brownfield site, my guess is it won't fit by quite a significant margin. Roughly. This is not one to sweat over, it's a kind of...
I'll get the proposed site plan up, and you can maybe... I'm not going to get into... well, draw your own conclusions.
Okay. Oh, thank you, because that kind of highlighted my point.
What might be of help, if it's in the report, as I think we've probably at the front end of the report talked about the relative site areas. So we've talked about the area of the PDI on paragraph 2.1, site area of the proposed PDI, the stadium, and then the unused parcel of land. So, yeah, it's 3.7 proposed. The existing stadium is 2.2. So on that basis, it doesn't fit.
Thank you. That was the sort of point I was just trying to clarify in my own mind. And finally, I'm just thinking about much has been said about the movement of vehicles. I won't get into my favourite subject, the Greenbelt, at this point. That would wait for debate. But when I think about the similar site that was created at Purfleet, that has the ability to use rail as well as road in terms of movement of vehicles, and obviously the vehicles come in via the river, and then they're distributed by rail stroke road. No?
Sorry, thank you, Chair. I believe Purfleet is only by road. I don't believe they go out by rail. I might be wrong. They do they? All right.
Purfleet Terminal imports vehicles from the two jetties. I thought they exported from the jetties as well, but I'm not convinced they bring them in by rail. There are rail sidings, but that's more for the aggregates terminal, which is sort of on the eastern boundary. I'm trying to visualise yeah, I don't think they do.
I understand where you mean. Okay, I assumed that they probably would have done, but never mind. It's not. It was just trying to understand how, from a logistics point of view, it could be eased. That was why I was asking the question. But that's not an option. That's the key to it, I guess. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew.
Okay, Councillor Polly, and then Councillor Carter.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just the reference about the roundabout on the previous application to this, I'm just looking at one of the maps. The roundabout is in the land ownership of the other applicant. I'm wondering do we know if the turning facility proposed in this application is limited by their use of land rather than, I mean, we're not saying that there wasn't a willingness for this applicant to put a better proposal forward, but they would be limited by their land ownership. Would I be correct?
Yeah, from a highways point of view, obviously, you could use part of the highway. In terms of the proposal that was put forward from ourselves as an option, yes, we would have had to take land to accommodate that roundabout. So I don't disagree that they have been limited on what they can do, but in terms of what they've done, we don't consider that that's potentially the most appropriate option that they could have put forward.
So, in my layman's terms, they've put forward the best they could with what they had, rather than...
Within their own land, yes, but there would have been nothing stopping them potentially saying to that, well, we will put a roundabout in, we'll have to go to the people opposite and ask if we can purchase some of their land. So it's not beyond doing something else, potentially.
Right, thank you. The Japanese knotweed, if I've understood correctly, and I'm not going to go too detailed in it, if we do nothing with the land, the Japanese knotweed's going to stay there and nobody's going to do anything with it. But if somebody does something with the land, we'll have to eradicate it. So that is that my understanding?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's the responsibility of a landowner. If they've got an invasive species, it's up to them to manage as they feel appropriate.
Thank you. My third and final question. The lower fields have been in the past subject to off-road motor vehicles, and they come in from off of the junction of sort of the A13, junction 30, 31. There has been historically quite a lot of trespass on that area, and there's been some very nasty accidents on that junction where off-road bikers have just pulled up their vehicles and gone out. I do note that there is a peripheral fence and some landscaping that probably would address some of those issues, I would think. I'm just wondering if anybody has walked those lower pitches, because I believe when Purfleet Football Club was there, they couldn't get a contractor to grass seed those pitches because they are so full of rock and flint. As you say, they flood. The soil erosion there is quite horrific, and they're unplayable. I just wondered if Sport England, I know with DEFRA, if land is out of use for a certain amount of time, it loses its agricultural status, for example. With Sport England referring to these as lost playing pitches, is there any length of time? I mean, do we know when the last game of football was ever played on those pitches?
Yeah, sorry, and just to follow up on that, Matt, does that time, I think he was leading to that, does the time scale expire? Because there's only so much Sports England can say they were pitches that were used. If they've not been used in 7 years, there must be an expiry when effectively Sports England are no longer part of the equation. Thank you.
I did put on an aerial picture. So I showed a current, and I showed 2014. And the 2014, I thought quite clearly showed that the practice pitches were used. There were goals, there were line markings. Well, I mean, we can look at the picture and we can go through, but I think you could take a reasonable view to say they were functional practice pitches. And anecdotally, I think other clubs have used it as well, because I support a non-league team and I know they've used that as pre-season before. The pitches haven't been used. Thurrock FC resigned from the league at the end of the 2017-2018 season. So we're now coming up to 5 years. On the point about does that playing field designation fall away, I'm going off the top of my head here. There is something in the Town and Country Planning Departures Direction, which is updated in 2021, I think it was, which has definitions about what counts as playing fields. If you wanted me to dig it out, we'd have to take a few minutes doing it. But I'm going to give you the straight back answer. We've consulted Sport England, and they put in a holding objection. It was a holding objection, wasn't it? Bear with me. Yeah, holding objection. Further information required on the basis of the mitigation and its relationship with the 3G pitch was the other item. If you wanted me to see if there's any further guidance in that direction, I'm happy to do it, because that's where the definition of playing pitch and playing field is defined. I'm not aware it's defined anywhere else in secondary legislation. So it's the Town and Country Planning Consultation Direction. I think it's it was 2009, but it was changed. You're really working me here.
Okay, whilst you're looking for that, Matt, I've got a highways question, and I'll just jump in whilst Matt's looking, and I'll come to yourself, Councillor Carter. So, Julian, obviously, we know there's historic issues with HGVs going down Ship Lane. Obviously, the applicant here is providing a solution. One of my understandings is when a HGV goes down Ship Lane, one of their excuses is there is nowhere to turn around. So, at least in this scenario, there would be an option. I know you said you're not sure how practical it would be. we're not sure until, let's say, hypothetically, it's built out. That's the first point. The second point was the council, it's on page 104, it says that the council was aware one of the best options for the bottom of Ship Lane would be a roundabout, and that issue's been addressed. But then on the next page, it sort of suggests, well, timescales for the delivery are unknown. I mean, strictly speaking, that's going to cost a huge volume of money. I mean, I would turn that round from unknown to, well, not anytime soon. So at least it brings some form of solution. And hypothetically, if both of these schemes were to be approved, it might be both rejected. But if they were approved, then that's a clash of heads, come up with a workable solution. So at least if this was to go ahead, they've got an option, whereas at the moment they don't. Is that correct? And that roundabout's never come in, is it? Not publicly funded anytime soon. Thank you.
Yeah, we're unlikely to publicly fund it anytime soon. But as I said, it doesn't necessarily stop a developer putting forward a solution as the Mardyke have put forward. I know it's within their land, but they put that forward as their potential solution. So it doesn't stop this site potentially putting that forward.
Okay, I'm going to go to Councillor Carter, then Councillor Watson, and then we'll go to statements and come to some form of conclusion. Councillor Carter.
My question's actually been answered since I raised my hand, so I'll withdraw it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Watson.
Thank you. Can I just clarify something, Julian? Car parking for the football pitch, is that sharing exactly the same as the PDI centre? Because there's no car parking outside the football club. Not according to this.
Thank you, Chair.
There's a red line. There's a red line that goes. The site. Sorry, Chair. Can I? So the site goes straight across Southway. Is it Southway? So there's the pitch for a bench for waiting, and then it's drawn up and over.
As far as I'm aware, when I park there to go to the DCO for the Port of Tilbury, there is a car park outside the football stadium.
So is that boundary not right then on there?
Thank you, everyone. Councillor Watson, can you continue? Okay, please carry on.
So
sorry.
is that boundary?
Sorry, I don't have a copy of the plan,
right
so I can't actually answer that part of the question. If somebody can put it up, then can you?
Thanks.
It's the white space. Can you get up on screen? There was a picture of the entrance of the roundabout. I thought that showed it.
So, as far as I'm aware, this white area in here is where the cars currently park, is it not? As I said, the car park, as far as I'm aware, is that big white area.
I definitely know where the car park is. But I'm just asking, it's on this side of Southway. It looks like it goes straight across, and this is the green area. And then it's got a green area that's landscaped on the left side of the Southway.
As far as I'm aware, they're linking into the existing access that goes into the hotel and the car park to the football club. So they'll slightly change the access such that the current, it won't swing round like it does at the moment, but it will join the access into the PDI centre.
So can you just confirm then that the access will be exactly the same as what it is now into the football ground?
No, it was slightly changed. The main access will go into the PDI centre.
Yeah,
the access to the car park and the hotel will be off of that access. It's difficult to see on a small plan, but the main access will go into the PDI centre.
Yeah.
At the moment, the access from the hotel and the and the football club that was there comes round onto the road, onto Ship Lane. That access will be reused, but that part of it, the main part, will go into the PDI centre. The access into the hotel and the football club car park will be a little offshoot off of that access,
Right, okay.
if you see what I mean. So it's not significantly changing. It's just that those people from the hotel and the football club, if it's there, will have to give way to traffic that's coming out from the PDI centre. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's go on to, so Councillor Carter, your question was answered. I think that's it for the moment in terms of questions. Now let's go to speaker statements. So we do have two statements here this evening. One's an objection, one's a joint statement of support. And I would like to invite down a statement of objection from Mr. John Rolls. I understand you're a chair of the Community Forum. Mr. Rolls, you've got 3 minutes in which to present your objections. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking to you regarding the above application on behalf of Purfleet Community Forum and Averley. Firstly, I must point out that although this site is within the boundary of POT, there has been no direct communication with the community or the forum or Purfleet Forum since prior to the first application. The fact that the application is now being made jointly by developers and Grays Football Club bears no relevance to this application. The football club will be the sole beneficiaries for this application, and it will not be the benefit of the general community of POT or Averley, who are both against this plan. The main part of the application, being the PDI centre, is of concern. The site is on Greenbelt, there is prone to flooding, and it is covered. If it is covered over, where will the water go? The application will destroy one of the last green buffers between the M25, A13, Purfleet-on-Thames and Averley. We suffer from some of the worst air quality in the area, which will be made worse by the increase in vehicle movements. Every vehicle will produce air pollution of some kind, irrespective of its type. The vehicles, I understand, and I must apologise, I've got the route back to front. I think my route's better as it goes. The application will, the vehicles, I understand, will be checked and tested on the highway. I believe the route for testing will be out of the SEP site by turning left to the M25 1306 interchange, all the way round taking the 1306 back towards London, then refuelling SO Meads service station, exits left onto the Purfleet bypass, Stonehouse roundabout, take the first exit onto Stonehouse Lane to M25 1306 interchange and back to Ship Lane. The question is, who's going to police this route? Who is going to check the drivers will adhere to this route when the road is blocked because of traffic issues? Are the operators of this site going to watch vehicles just wait until the road clears? I very much doubt it. When it comes to Greenbelt, it's not the best, but it's a damn sight better than having a PDI site with pollution, etc. that comes with it. This area is entrance to a nice village. Will this plan make life better for Averley and Purfleet-on-Thames? I can answer that. The answer is no. Averley already has a football ground and an open football areas. On the other hand, Purfleet-on-Thames has nothing and will still have nothing. So the carrot that has been offered will go to an organisation over 5 miles down the road. So why would we support an application where there's nothing in it for us? I will therefore ask the committee to reject this application for all the right reasons. It's detrimental to one of the final green buffers between Thurrock and London. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rolls there for your statement. And then that takes us on to a joint statement from a Mr. Glyn Jarvis and Julian Sutton. Gentlemen, you have 3 minutes in which to speak, and I understand you're going to split that statement up. So best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Glyn Jarvis, an elected director of Grays Athletic Football Club, and we are joint applicants with Group 1. We are 100% owned by our supporters, a true community football club. We have been homeless since 2010. We understand the Ship Lane land has been valued at £3 million by the selling agent. We could never afford to buy this site. Through this planning application, we will be given the stadium for free. If approved, we will bring the dilapidated ground back to life after 5 years of it lying completely dormant. We will enter into a legal agreement so the land remains as a sports ground forever, and it will become a community asset for all time. A community use agreement will ensure at least 50% of pitch time for the wider football community in Thurrock as well as Grays Athletic teams. If the application is refused or deferred, Group 1's option to purchase the land will expire soon. They are currently paying thousands of pounds per year in business rates for an empty piece of land. Those payments will stop, and advisors say the stadium will be demolished. If you let this happen, the dream dies. This is last chance saloon for our football club. Without a permanent ground to call our own, this could lead to the death of an institution that has been in Thurrock for over 130 years. Thank you, councillors.
And Mr. Sutton, that was a minute and a half. You have a minute and a half as well. Thank you.
Members, I've been listening to the discussion tonight. We recognise that this is a complex application which turns on matters of judgment. In respect to the site, we do think you need to see it to believe it in order to take a look at the current state of the site and also to appreciate the highway benefits which have been debated tonight, and also the significant new tree, landscaping, planting, and the ecological enhancements. I think members have had a number of questions asked tonight, which I don't think have been fully answered. On this basis, it would be the applicant's suggestion and request that members defer consideration of this application tonight in order to undertake a site visit in May. We believe this would be a sensible and pragmatic way forward to ensure that all matters relevant to this complicated application are properly appreciated before members can make a decision. And I think this will allow members to understand issues relating to the car parking, landscaping and so forth. I'm also acutely aware that there's been much misinformation circulated about this application. In this respect, a deferral would allow the applicant to undertake further direct consultation with the people of Aveley and Purfleet in order to clarify some of the truths and untruths which have been circulated. It would also allow the applicant to review the issue of the design, as suggested by the officer, and also for us to continue to liaise with Sport England. On this basis, I would therefore request that the application be deferred, and this would obviously be in line with the committee's decision with respect to the previous application on the Mardyke. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for those statements there. So obviously this has been to us before. I think the first time it came, I'm not sure the second, but the first time I asked for a site visit. Obviously there's been a request there to defer. Does anyone have any opinions on that, Councillor Polly? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Since the previous application, we now have the Mardyke alongside that. We have agreed for a site visit to that earlier. Yeah, I certainly want to go and walk them pitches, as I alluded to earlier, and I do agree that we have got, you know, I can only compliment our officers, but in particular Matt, he has he's fielded a whole raft of questions tonight, and it would be wrong to expect him to have had all the answers, but just in the interest of democracy and transparency that just proves that none of this was preempted. This has all happened as the meeting has evolved. So I certainly do have an appetite to go for a site visit for this application and possibly even the next, to be honest, just to as Sports England are saying that the pitches on the PDI are not replaceable with the other site. I think we need to see all three in context. That's my feeling. I don't know how the rest of the committee feel.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, there's a few people nodding their head there. If that's seconded, site visit. Ken, are you happy for us to, unless there was any comments, I'll move a site visit. Okay. Yeah. So, site visit, seconded by Councillor Polly. I'm going to go to the vote. Ken, are you?
Sorry, Chair, can I just confirm who first and seconded the site visit?
So myself first, Councillor Polly seconded. Okay, fantastic. Okay, all those in favour, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. All right, so that's brilliant. Okay, thank you. And then obviously that takes us on to our last item of this evening, obviously closely linked to this one. Over to yourself. Yeah, what I'll do, because there's a speaker statement. We'll get that in. Yeah. Sorry, Councillor Mays.
Sorry, Chair. We've all said about looking at this as a project or looking at them all with site visits. Would it be worth just going straight to the site visit, or do we have to have see the application first?
I'm open to that. What's the general feeling? Happy? Linked? Yeah. Happy? You happy? Yeah.
Site visit.
Are you happy? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, who would like to recommend site visit? Councillor Shinnick, seconded by Councillor Mays. I'll just go through the formalities. Sorry. Application reference 22, or application item 9, 22/01673, Bellis Park Golf and Country Club, Bellis Park, found on pages 119 to 130. Recommended site visit, seconded. We'll go to the vote, yeah, on the site visit. Yeah. All those in favour of the site visit? Councillor Watson, you okay? You're not yeah, okay. All right then. Thank you. Any abstentions there? No? Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time this evening. We'll see you in June, hopefully.